The sterile, uniform gleam of the digital spreadsheets that track our daily micro-habits does not serve as a record of our liberation, but rather functions as a cold, analytical cage for our transactional souls. We sit in the quiet privacy of our modern apartments, our eyes reflecting the neat rows of color-coded data blocks, the daily hydration charts, the meditation minute logs, and the productivity graphs that analyze our personal development down to the nearest percentage point. The air in our rooms carries the faint, static smell of overheated electronic processor scent that has become the definitive fragrance of our internal landscapes, evoking a world where every gesture, every breath, and every emotional movement must be audited, balanced, and verified before it is allowed to clear our internal security checks. We look at our life management systems, our daily self-improvement logs, and our meticulously catalogued relationship journals, and we feel a momentary, superficial wave of righteousness. We tell ourselves that we are simply being responsible architects of our evolution, that we are practicing emotional intelligence, and that we are protecting ourselves from the chaotic, messy, and unfair dynamics of unexamined relationships. Yet, if we stand perfectly still beneath the harsh light of our monitors, the order we experience does not feel like the rich, spacious freedom of an open meadow. It feels like the thin, exhausting pressure of a permanent corporate audit. We look at our partners, our friends, and our colleagues, and we perceive the distinct, chilly atmosphere of an internal counting house. We have become a society of emotional accountants, individuals who have imported the language of corporate balance sheets, legal liability, and financial auditing into the sacred spaces of our intimate lives. We have turned our personal worth and our ordinary human interactions into an ongoing, relentless transaction ledger, keeping strict, hypervigilant tallies of who owes what in terms of emotional labor, validation, apologies, and domestic care. We use our psychological literacy not to hold space for the wild, uneven asymmetry of human love, but to build an unassailable case of moral creditworthiness, measuring every act of service against an expected return on investment. In this constant effort to maintain an equilibrium of fairness, we find ourselves profoundly, systemically exhausted. We are caught in a brilliant, self-imposed prison where the more we track the equity of our relationships, the more resentful, suspicious, and depleted our hearts become. We have optimized ourselves into a state of acute relational starvation. We look at our social circles and our domestic partnerships through the cold lens of our internal auditing grids, and we feel a deep, ambient grief, the grief of an entity that has successfully eliminated all risk, all messiness, and all unilateral generosity from its life, leaving its world ethically pristine yet utterly dead. We have constructed a life that is perfectly balanced on paper, where no one takes advantage of us, where our boundaries are never crossed without an immediate cost, and where our emotional investments are tightly policed, but in doing so, we have successfully bled our lives of all spontaneous warmth, all wild joy, and all radical, uncalculated belonging. We look at one another across the polished wood of our dining tables, or through the clinical text blocks of our digital communication channels, and we participate in a highly sophisticated warfare of mutual auditing. We use the contemporary vocabulary of relational equity, emotional safety, and energetic reciprocity to mask a deep, desperate terror of being cheated, telling our partners that we simply require a fair distribution of labor and a matching level of emotional output. If a close companion fails to return a favor with the exact same velocity, if they forget to validate our struggle in the precise vocabulary we demand, or if they fall into a dark period of depression where they cannot match our daily contributions to the relationship, our first instinct is no longer to run to their side with our arms open and our pockets turned inside out. Our first instinct is to open our internal ledger book, recording a psychological debt against their name. We treat other people's human limitations as if they are financial defaults, breaches of contract that threaten our emotional solvency, completely blind to the fact that we are converting our most intimate circles into cold, transactional trading posts. We have arrived at a state of deep existential bankruptcy where our growth is measured entirely by the tally sheet. We have forgotten that to live fully is to be capable of radical, asymmetric giving, to possess an interior treasury that is so vast, so wild, and so anchored in the infinite nature of awareness that it can pour itself out into the world without checking the balance sheet or waiting for a receipt. We have substituted the warm, chaotic blood of unconditional love for the cold, predictable arithmetic of the trade. We spend our evenings reviewing our moral credit scores, drafting mental scripts to remind our lovers of how much we have improved while they have remained static, and validating our isolation through an endless stream of advice that tells us to cut off anyone who does not immediately match our vibration. We have made ourselves completely unexploitable, but we have also made ourselves entirely incapable of tasting the boundless, unearned grace of existence. We feel this exhaustion as a chronic, tightening ache in the very center of our diaphragms and solar plexus, a physical compression that reminds us of the body's native capacity to simply breathe, to spill over, and to receive without a single calculation. We are homesick for a world where we were brave enough to lose count, where we were resilient enough to endure an uneven week without running to our ledger books for reassurance, and where we could perform an act of pure kindness without secretly recording it in our internal treasury of moral superiority. We are terrified to lower our balance scales because we know that the moment we drop our internal ledgers, we will have to face the absolute unpredictability of human need. We will have to stand in the middle of our lives without our moral credit lines. We will have to endure the terrifying vulnerability of giving without a guarantee of return. And we will have to risk the deep, shattering beauty of loving someone who may never be able to fully repay the debt. We have built our entire identity on being the one who is fair, the one who is optimized, the one who keeps the books clean, and the thought of becoming a boundless, uncalculating space of pure offering feels like a total annihilation of the ego. But it is precisely within that annihilation, precisely within that burning of the ledger book, that our true, unconditional freedom waits, calling through the frozen arithmetic of our chests to clear the slate, smash the scales, and finally dare to live. To trace the full expansion of this transactional disease, we must look at the archetypal figure of the emotional accountant, an individual whose daily existence has been converted into a highly managed, continuous audit of interpersonal dynamics and self-evolution. This is someone who operates with supreme psychological literacy, an expert practitioner of behavioral mapping who can track the subtle shifting of relational equity with the swift analytical precision of a forensic bookkeeper. Every interaction they engage in, from the division of domestic responsibilities to the exact volume of emotional support exchanged during a weekend conversation, is run through an internal computational software designed to ensure absolute fairness and mitigate the risk of exploitation. They have studied every framework of codependency, memorized every rule of emotional boundaries, and populated their minds with an unassailable record of their own personal improvements and moral credits. They move through their social and romantic circles with an appearance of total clarity, their communication clean, direct, and stripped of any loose, messy spontaneity that could create an untatalogued emotional debt. But if we step past this impressive, hyper-rationalized exterior, if we possess the eye of a trained anatomical investigator, we can see that this person's physical body has been converted into an absolute prison of chronic tension and defensive scorekeeping. Consider the deep architecture of the diaphragm and the solar plexus of this internal auditor. If we look closely at the tissue surrounding the crura of the diaphragm and the celiac plexus, the dense network of nerves sitting just behind the stomachway, find them held in an unrelenting, permanent state of upward contraction. The breath is never allowed to drop fully and loosely into the deep caverns of the lower belly. Instead, it is arrested at the mid-torso checkpoint, held back by a rigid muscular band that functions as a physical filter for all incoming and outgoing emotional energy. This chronic constriction is the somatic infrastructure of the internal audita mechanical mechanism, designed to ensure that the individual never expresses a spontaneous feeling, an uncalculated apology, or an unregulated burst of generosity before the mind has evaluated the tactical equity of the move. The solar plexus is as hard as a knot of dry wood, choking off the literal current of raw, unpolished vitality, leaving the person operating in a permanent state of computational depletion. Moving downward past the hips, we observe the precise and exhausting toll that this ledger-keeping mentality inflicts upon the soleus muscles and the Achilles tendons of the lower legs. For the perpetual emotional accountant, the heels are never truly permitted to drop completely and heavily into the earth. The muscles of the calves are held in a state of hypervigilant, low-grade contraction, keeping the body perpetually braced on its toes, ready at any microsecond to spring forward, to claim a moral debt, to defend a personal perimeter, or to demonstrate their own superior behavioral correctness. This rigid alignment cuts off the body's natural relationship with gravity, transforming the legs into tense, structural pillars that treat the very ground of relationship not as a place of rest, but as a volatile trading floor where one must always be ready to move, to negotiate, or to withdraw their assets at the first sign of an uneven exchange. The lower legs are locked in a continuous state of high-alert anticipation, generating a silent, systemic fatigue that climbs up the spine and reinforces the cognitive suspicion that relationship is an inherently unsafe marketplace where one must never let down their guard. The most intimate toll of this transactional armor, however, is mapped directly onto the base of the tongue and the deep, intrinsic muscles of the jaw. If we look at the pterygoid and hyoglossus muscles of this validation bookkeeper, we find them held in an unrelenting vice-like squeeze. This is the anatomical apparatus required to measure and weigh every word before it is allowed to enter the air. When the emotional accountant speaks, their sentences are impeccably crafted, legally defensive, and entirely stripped of any raw, uncalculated warmth that could be misconstrued as a concession or an unreciprocated surrender. They cannot allow the base of the tongue to soften or the jaw to go genuinely slack, because a loose, undefended throat might release a ragged, unpolished truther, spontaneous admission of longing, a messy, unconditional apology, or a cry of pure human vulnerability that hasn't been cleared by the internal legal department. The voice is flattened into a controlled tactical instrument, and the jaw is held like a locked cash register, ensuring that no emotional currency is spent without a guaranteed receipt of equal value from the other side. The behavioral consequence of this physical armoring is a self-generating cycle of radical hollowing. Because the body is held in this permanent state of somatic contraction, the autonomic nervous system remains locked in a continuous, low-grade sympathetic survival response. The brain, tracking the tight diaphragm, the braced calves, and the clenched jaw, concludes that the surrounding relational environment is a hostile territory filled with emotional predators who are constantly seeking to exploit, deplete, and bankrupted the self. The analytical mind then projects this internal terror onto every ordinary asymmetry of daily intimacy. If a partner forgets to ask about their day with the exact frequency they expect, or if a friend is too overwhelmed by their own life to immediately reciprocate a gesture of care, the accountant's internal software instantly registers a massive relational deficit. This diagnostic panic convinces the mind that the only way to stay safe is to enforce even stricter tally sheets, to demand higher interest on emotional debts, and to withdraw into a state of proud, angry moral isolation, entire blind to the fact that the emptiness and depletion they are running from are being generated by the very armor they are using to keep the books fair. The deep psychological root of this obsession is the ancient, unhealed trauma of early relational insolvency, the ghost of a childhood where love, attention, and basic emotional safety were never given freely as an unearned grace, but had to be continuously earned, bought and traded for through perfect behavior, high achievements, or the suppression of one's own needs. At some point in their formative history, usually within the architecture of a family system that was emotionally bankrupt or heavily transactional, this child discovered that their raw, spontaneous presence was not enough to guarantee protection. They learned that to survive, they had to become a master trader, keeping precise track of how much they pleased others, how much credit they accumulated, and how to defend themselves against the sudden, unpredictable defaults of their caregivers. The adult accountant we see today is simply that hyper-vigilant child who has grown up, acquired an advanced master's degree in psychological terminology, and built a massive, multi-million-dollar auditing infrastructure around a heart that is still fundamentally terrified of being abandoned or left destitute by the world. They keep the scales in front of their chest, because they are running from the historical ghost of their own inherent unworthiness, using the arithmetic of fairness to protect a treasury that is already starving to death from a total lack of fresh air and unconditional rain. To comprehend the absolute, soul-crushing weight of this constant interpersonal bookkeeping, we must turn our gaze toward a specific ancient instrument that stands in the center of a cold, forgotten sanctuary, the rusting balancer scale. Imagine an immense, highly ornate scale forged from heavy, black iron, hanging from the vaulted stone ceiling of an ancient hall where judges and merchants have gathered for generations. A devotee stands before this massive iron machine, having dedicated decades of their adult life to its maintenance, believing that this scale is the ultimate arbiter of truth, cosmic order, and personal protection. Every single interaction that occurs in their life is brought into this cold hall to be weighed. When the devotee performs an act of service, offers an apology, or completes a task of self-improvement, they carefully place a small, gleaming gold weight onto the left pan of the scale, recording their moral credit. But when a partner, a friend, or a family member delivers a perceived slight, forgets a compliment, or fails to return an emotional investment with equal velocity, the devotee instantly drops a jagged, heavy black stone onto the right pan, marking the debt. Let us look closely at the mechanical condition of this iron scale as the years pass uninterrupted inside the damp stone hall. The scale is not a timeless, flawless instrument of divine justice. It is a crude, heavy piece of industrial metal subject to the uncompromised laws of corrosion and decay. Because the atmosphere of the room is heavy with the salt water of tears and the damp vapors of silent resentment, the iron pivots of the scale begin to rust, locking up the delicate gears and freezing the crossbeam in a rigid, tilted position. The devotee can no longer see that the scale has stopped moving entirely, that the mechanism is completely jammed, and that the gold weights and black stones they place on the pans have ceased to represent any real living truth. They have become an absolute slave to the dead iron, spending their mornings polishing the rusted pans and balancing the books, entirely blind to the fact that the massive weight of the scale is no longer assessing their relationships, but is instead dragging their own spine down into the dust, keeping them locked in a state of eternal, cold surveillance. This is the exact catastrophe that unfolds within our psychological and creative lives when we are caught in the grip of the internal accountant. The rusting balances scale is our hyper-analytical mind, the complex web of moral credits, emotional tallies, and behavioral scorekeeping that we use to ensure that we are never cheated or exploited by the world. We stay inside this mental counting house for years, telling ourselves that we are just protecting our boundaries, that we are just demanding healthy reciprocity, and that we are just keeping our lives fair. But we are only succeeding in making ourselves completely bankrupt. We are suffocating our relationships with the dry, transactional math of the trade, entirely blind to the fact that while we are busy calculating who owes what on the chalkboard of our brains, the real, unpredictable, and wild currents of human connection are passing us by, leaving our hearts completely frozen inside our own accounts. It is precisely at this point of deep transactional exile that the sharp, uncompromising blade of the awakened one's wisdom cuts through our performative accounts. In the profound maps of consciousness left behind by the ancient masters, there is an intensive investigation into how our demand for mathematical fairness and emotional equity multiplies our suffering. This mechanism is explained through the timeless teaching of the two arrows. When an ordinary human being enters into the sacred, unscripted landscape of relationship, they are instantly struck by the first arrow. This first arrow is simply the raw, honest, and unavoidable truth of human asymmetry, the basic cosmic fact that love is rarely mathematically equal in every hour, and that our partners, friends, and parents will occasionally fall short, forget to validate us, fail to return a favor, or drop into periods of depression where they cannot match our emotional investments. It is the simple reality that human beings are clumsy, limited creatures who cannot always pay their emotional debts on time. This first arrow is uncomfortable, but it is limited, natural, and a fundamental part of the contract of sharing an atmosphere with other human souls. However, for the hyper-vigilant accountant living in front of the rusted scale, the arrival of this first arrow is treated as an unacceptable breach of contract, a terrifying threat to their emotional solvency. Instead of allowing the uneven asymmetry of the moment to be felt, instead of leaning into the raw, heavy vulnerability of loving someone through their deficit, they notch a second arrow into their bow and drive it deep into their own flesh with their own hands. But this time, the second arrow is fashioned out of auditing, panic, and moral credit-seeking. The mind explodes into a frenzy of frantic calculations, screaming internally, "I am being exploited. They are taking advantage of my growth. If I give more without a return, I will be completely bankrupted. I must withhold my warmth until they pay their debt." This second arrow is the arrow of radical resistance to our shared reality, using our intelligence to turn an ordinary relational limitation into a full-scale legal war, nursing old resentments like gold coins, and withdrawing into a state of proud, angry moral isolation, choosing to starve to death from a total lack of connection rather than enduring a single hour of uncalculated, asymmetrical love. The core fallacy that drives this performance is the illusion of the independent, sovereign trader. The hyper-calibrated mind operates under the delusional belief that the ego is an isolated merchant who sits at a distance from the world, buying, trading, or earning peace through calculated, transactionally fair maneuvers. We treat our relationships as if they are financial marketplaces where we must maintain a balanced budget, completely blind to the supreme law of nature, the law of non-self and boundless interdependence. The awakened one looked deep into the fabric of reality and realized that there are no separate ledgers in this universe, and there are no permanent credit lines to defend. Life is not a commercial marketplace. It is an infinite, unownable stream of interexistence where every breath we take is an unearned grace, where the light of the sun is given without a receipt, and where nothing has ever belonged to anyone. The ancient sages reminded us that ultimate emotional freedom is not found by perfectly balancing the moral books. It is found by having the radical courage to burn the ledger book entirely, to smash the iron scales, and to realize that we are already sitting in the center of an infinite treasury that requires no scorekeeping to exist. Turning our lives from a cold, defensive calculation into a boundless, uncalculated field of pure offering. The realization that our internal counting house has merely turned into a vault of deep relational starvation does not mean we must violently discard our boundaries or invite reckless exploitation into our lives. Rather, it provides us with the first genuine opportunity to lift our eyes from the rusted pans and walk into the open field. We stand at the center of our mental sanctuaries, looking at the immense piles of gold weights and black stones we have accumulated to protect our egos. But now we see them as heavy monuments to our historical fear of being abandoned or left destitute. The work before us is not to become foolish or blind, but to cultivate a profound internal architecture of retraining. We must learn the practice of absolute debtlessness, a systematic method of mind and body cultivation that allows a human being to dissolve their transactional armor and step into the boundless, uncalculated current of the immediate hour. We must train our tissues and our thoughts to stop tracking the moral ledger, allowing our true nature to rest deeply within the solid, self-sustaining baseline of a life that has nothing to collect and nothing to prove. This retraining begins at the most basic interface of our biology, with the physical dismantling of our ledger armor, starting with the deep unlocking of the diaphragm and the solar plexus. Because we have spent decades using our intellect to audit our interpersonal dynamics, the dense network of nerves behind the stomach is held in an unrelenting state of upward, defensive contraction. We begin by directing a soft, heavy, and completely uncritical attention directly into this mid-torso checkpoint. In the middle of an ordinary day, while standing in a kitchen, drafting a text message, or waiting for a partner to complete a domestic task, we invite the diaphragm to grow wide, loose, and spacious. We let the breath drop straight past the ribcage, allowing the stomach to soften completely, breaking the rigid muscular band that has policed our emotional expressions for years. We train the mind to realize a profound biological truth. We do not need to hold back our breath or freeze our belly to maintain our emotional composure or calculate our next response. As this mid-torso knot thaws, we allow our awareness to drip downward through the hips, past the knees, initiating a deep somatic release of the soleus muscles and the Achilles tendons in the lower legs. We locate that tight, hypervigilant bracing that holds our heels slightly off the ground, keeping us poised on our toes like traders on a volatile market floor. We deliberately invite the back of our calves to lengthen, letting the full weight of our heels drop completely, heavily, and unconditionally into the floor beneath our boots. We train the nervous system to let go of its chronic readiness to spring forward, to defend a moral position, or to claim a psychological debt. We allow the lower legs to rest in a deep mutual relationship with gravity, transforming our legs from tense structural pillars into solid, relaxed roots that can receive the earth without checking a balance sheet or demanding an insurance policy against failure. Moving upward past the spine, we bring this soft attention directly into the base of the tongue and the deep muscles of the jaw. We bring our full awareness to that tight, hidden squeeze where we hold our words back, weighing them for tactical impact and stripping them of their natural warmth before they enter the air. We actively invite the pterygoid muscles to unlock, letting the jaw go genuinely slack, allowing the tongue to rest heavily on the floor of the mouth like a soft piece of wet cloth. We break the porcelain mold of the professional mask, letting our voices drop back into their natural, uncalculated resonance. We train the body to understand that a loose, undefended throat is not an invitation to ruin, but the very gate through which our raw, unpolished humanity can finally breathe spill over, and connect with the world without a legal clearance from our internal departments. By dropping the heels, softening the belly, and unlocking the jaw, we collapse the physical infrastructure of our transactional addiction, converting our bodies from stiff, accounting monoliths into open, fluid spaces of presence. Within this relaxed somatic framework, we introduce the practice of the unrecorded offering. This is the mental and behavioral discipline of intentionally executing acts of kindness, artistic expression, or domestic care that are completely unwitnessed, unreturned, and immediately erased from our internal tally sheets. We dedicate ourselves to performing small, secret gestures of love for our partners, our friends, or complete strangers without letting anyone know we did them, and without allowing our minds to record a single moral credit line in our internal archives. We clean a counter, we leave a gift, we write an encouraging note, or we offer a quiet moment of profound validation to a companion, and the exact second the act is completed, we take a deep breath into our wide, relaxed lower bellies, and we consciously delete the transaction from our brains. We take this uncalculated step with our boots firmly planted on the ground, allowing ourselves to experience the raw, magnificent texture of a choice that expects no receipt. We train our nervous systems to tolerate the exquisite discomfort of an unwitnessed, unreciprocated output. If the mind begins to panic during this unrecorded hour, if it begins to scream that we are being exploited, that we are losing our leverage, or that our boundaries are being erased, we do not reach for our ledger books to rebalance our accounts. We do not demand an immediate apology or a matching gesture of validation from the other side. We stay in the room. We feel the raw weight of the transactional vacuum landing on our soft, bare chests, and we breathe straight into the center of the anxiety. We train the brain to realize that our emotional solvency does not depend on the return of the investment, but on our capacity to realize that we are already connected to an infinite, self-sustaining treasury of pure awareness that cannot be bankrupted by a single hour of asymmetrical love. As we stabilize this capacity to give without counting, we turn our attention toward our most difficult relational friction, initiating the practice of welcoming the asymmetry. When a partner, a friend, or a family member falls into a dark period of exhaustion, depression, or human limitation, where they cannot match our daily contributions to the relationship, we refuse to treat their deficit as a breach of contract. We step past our rusted scales, we unlock our throats, and we choose to stand raw and present within the middle of their deficit. We do not use their limitations to build a case of moral superiority or to withhold our warmth as a tactical punishment. We look at the uneven flow of love not as a financial catastrophe that requires a legal audit, but as a supreme sacred invitation to discover our true, boundless nature. We choose to love them unconditionally through their winter, letting our egos be thoroughly dismantled, broken open, and washed clean by the uncalculating velocity of our own generosity. This renluent tum tree requires a fierce, moment-by-moment discipline that must be executed in the middle of our ordinary, hyper-optimized days, especially when our old habits of scorekeeping are triggered by the world. It is the practice of catching the mind at the exact microsecond when it wants to open the ledger book or adjust its behavior to demand a receipt. It is noticing the moment your hand freezes over a phone because you are waiting for them to text you first to match your output, or the moment your throat tightens to hold back a sincere compliment because you are tracking who apologized last. In that precise instant of auditing panic, you catch the impulse. You do not react, you do not calculate, and you do not run to your balance scales. You take a deep, unrestricted breath into the very bottom of your wide, relaxed lower legs. You drop your shoulders. You allow your jaw to go completely slack under the influence of presence, and you choose to clear the slate instantly, rawly, and without a net. You train your mind to understand that your ultimate liberation is not found by perfectly balancing the moral books, but by having the radical courage to burn the ledger book entirely, to smash the iron scales, and to realize that you are already sitting in the center of an infinite treasury that requires no scorekeeping to exist, turning your entire life from a cold, defensive calculation into a boundless, uncalculated field of pure offering. As this uncalculating softening settles into the deep, quiet architecture of our biology, the cold, static atmosphere of our internal counting houses finally disperses, replaced by the warm, wild, and limitless fresh air of an unaudited existence. The heavy iron balancer scales we spent decades maintaining, desperately polishing the pans to ensure an equilibrium of fairness, dissolve back into the unowned clay from which they were forged. This is the realization of absolute debtlessness, a state of consciousness where we no longer view our growth, our morals, or our intimate relationships through the thin, exhausting lens of a transaction ledger. We walk out of the cold sanctuaries of our personal audits and step directly onto the wet, unplotted soil of our immediate lives, and the frantic, hyper-vigilant habit of tracking our moral credits falls completely silent. We are no longer trading for love or earning our peace. We are living our lives from a place of infinite surplus, resting deeply within the self-sustaining baseline of a heart that has nothing to collect and nothing to owe. The physical experience of this surrender is marked by an extraordinary sense of expansion and deep somatic grounding. Our diaphragm moves with an unhindered, three-dimensional fluidity, allowing the breath to drop completely past the ribcage and pool heavily in the deep caverns of our soft lower belly. The celiac plexus, which once held the body in a knot of defensive vigilance, relaxes completely, opening the gate for our raw, unpolished vitality to circulate freely through our tissues. Our heels drop heavily into the earth, their ancient onthetos bracing dissolved by the profound realization that the ground of relationship is not a volatile trading floor, but a space of deep rest. The base of the tongue grows soft, the pterygoid muscles of the jaw unlock entirely, and our voices return to their natural, uncalibrated frequencies, releasing our words into the air with a loose, honest warmth that requires no legal clearance from our internal strategy departments. We move through our days not as merchants calculating the risk of exploitation, but as open, porous spaces that can receive and pour out love without checking the balance sheet. In this state of absolute debtlessness, we discover the immense, life-giving freedom of a mind that has burned its ledger book. We are no longer paralyzed by the uneven asymmetries of human intimacy, nor do we treat our companion's limitations as a breach of contract that threatens our emotional solvency. When we are no longer terrified of being cheated, we lose our brittle, defensive vigilance and acquire the deep, unshatterable resilience of an open field. We can execute our secret acts of service, offer our unscripted apologies, and stay rawly present in the middle of another's deficit with a profound, unshakable sovereignty. We have broken the second arrow of auditing panic across our knees and scattered its splinters into the long grass. We are finally brave enough to stand undefended within the first arrow of our shared human clumsy reality, discovering that the highest expression of our personal evolution is not a perfectly balanced account, but the radical capacity to lose count entirely. We realize as we stand in this vast, unaudited landscape the ultimate meaning of the boundless treasury left behind by the ancient sages. The awakened one did not achieve his liberation by keeping a strict tally sheet of his virtues, or by demanding a matching reciprocity from the world. He achieved it by recognizing that his true nature was not an isolated, separate merchant trying to buy peace, but the infinite, unownable fabric of interdependence itself. He sat beneath the Bodhi tree, completely open to the wind, the rain, the praise, and the insults of the cosmos, holding no ledger, recording no debts, and claiming no moral credit scores. He was reminding us for all eternity that true emotional wealth is not found by collecting the debts of those who have wronged us, but by realizing that we are already sitting in the middle of a universe that gives us everything for nothing, where the light of the stars, the rhythm of the seasons, and the very air in our lungs are given as an unearned grace, requiring no receipt to exist. We stand now at the threshold of our own lives, the cold stone halls of our transaction ledgers left far behind us, the rusting scales melted down, no longer needed by a creature that has learned how to breathe without a tally sheet. The digital spreadsheets have been erased, the habit trackers are gone, and the static, dry smell of our old optimization routines has been completely replaced by the deep, fertile scent of the earth after a heavy rain. We look down at our bare feet, deeply rooted in the ground, and we feel the immense warmth of a chest that has finally dropped the burden of the trade. We can choose to step back inside the counting house, to lock ourselves behind our boundaries, to reopen our ledger books, and to spend the rest of our days tracking who owes us what, while our actual lives freeze to death inside our accounts. Or we can choose the path of absolute debtlessness, stepping forward into the wild, asymmetric current of our tomorrow with our bellies soft, our heels down, and our hearts completely clear. As you walk into the unscripted theater of this very hour, with all its limited people, its uneven balances, and its fierce invitations to love without a net, the choice remains entirely yours. What would change in your life if you finally dared to tear up your internal invoices and chose to move through the world not as a creditor looking for payment, but as a boundless, uncalculated field of pure offering?